I want people to tell me what have they learned so far. So raise your hand instead of me picking people. What have you learned? Just give me, like, very brief. What have you learned? Okay, so in the universe had a cause to begin. Okay, what else? Yes?
Don't separate God from science.
Don't separate God from science. What else? Somebody from this side. What have you learned? I talked for almost about 40 minutes. Come on, guys. Yes. Coexist. What does that mean? Exactly. So don't feel kind of confused having separated. What else? Yes. Okay. So the limits. I want to say the limits of time and space does not give you enough like that to have just by chance. Okay. What were the two arguments we gave? So okay, let's just one other thing. The difference between evidence and experiment. Both of them are considered what for science? Tools? Tools or proofs? Okay. What is the difference between evidence and experiment? Okay. Okay. So evidence is usually looking in the back. Experiment is usually you're doing something. It's a prospective. Okay? Alright. Can you use evidence or experiment to prove God? No. Yes or no? Okay, the back there? You could. Okay. How can you use an experiment to prove God? Okay, so is the creation of the world evidence or is it experiment? It's evidence, exactly. You guys have to try to be careful. Remember when I said at the very beginning, what I try to get to is a little bit of framework and some language, okay? So you got to think, when somebody's bringing you something, is this evidence or is this experiment? Okay, and try to differentiate. What were the two big kind of, pieces of evidence we used for the science pointing to the existence of God? We talked about the first thing, okay, just right. Okay, so the universe has a beginning. Okay, what are some evidence that the universe has a beginning? Guys, can you settle down a little bit? Either spread out or just settle down. Okay, please, thank you. What are the evidence that we have for that the universe has a beginning? Expanding. What else?
Cosmology.
Okay, what is that? Give me even read the phrase, like put the phrase. Word is long. Say again. It's pretty short of the resources. So the resources are decreasing. Okay, so if they're decreasing, that points that they had a point in the beginning. Remember the example I gave of having $100, okay? If I have $100 today, tomorrow I've got 80, tomorrow after that I've got 60, okay? If I had an infinite number of dollars, I would always have an infinite number of dollars. But the fact that I have a finite number of dollars points that at some point I began to have a finite number of dollars, okay? So if I have a finite amount of energy that is decreasing, it points by just logical that at some point this was what? Started and it was given as a finite amount of energy. Okay? So the universe has a beginning. And then using the cosmological argument, which somebody mentioned very nicely, is that anything that has a beginning has to have a first cause or a first mover or something, somebody outside of it that began it. Okay? So that was the first evidence, which is that the universe has a beginning. What was the second one? The universe is... Say again? The expanding is actually under the family that it has a beginning. So when you say the universe has a beginning, there's evidence underneath it. That it's expanding, it has a finite amount of energy. What was the second big family of evidence? That the universe is what?
Fine-tuned.
Fine-tuned, exactly. Fine-tuned. What comes underneath this fine-tuned? What kind of evidence can you say? There are so many what? Right, there's so many findings or constants that are so fine-tuned to 10 to the power of 122 that if this would just shift from the range just by a little bit, the universe would have not existed. Okay? Somebody would come and tell you, well, this could have happened by chance. If you give chance enough time, this could have happened. What would you answer? What would you say to that? There's not enough space, and there are not enough planets that even exist You know, you can talk about a theory as much as you want, but there are not enough planets that exist that can even account for such a chance. What about time? What about time? You know, somebody tells like, you know what, hey, the universe has been around for like 13 billion years. You know, with enough time, it could have just, you know, by chance could have happened. What would you say to that? Yes?
The number of seconds.
Cannot even account for that. Exactly. So within the limits of space and time, chance cannot even get up to that constant. And then when you add all these constants, these numbers together, if you have such something that, two options, either by chance or by design. You've canceled the fact that it could happen by chance, that it happened by what? Design. Okay? So now, what we've talked about so far, guys, is looking outside. Okay? Looking to the heavens. Now I want us to look what? Inside. You remember when I said about when you're making an argument, you don't make an argument from only one standpoint? You have to make an argument from astronomy, from cosmology, you have to make an argument from biology, you have to make an argument from philosophy. I had some very nice discussions in the middle about philosophical arguments, because there is a lot of philosophy there. You have to make some arguments from the Bible as well. Maybe I will not start there when you're arguing against an atheist, but you still have to know that. You put all this together, there's not a single argument that just right out there says that God exists. So I want us to talk a little bit about creation versus evolution. When you look at this, we're going from the beginning of the cosmos, so the Big Bang. The Big Bang talks about what? About the creation of what? The universe. To now, beginning of life, bios. There is a bit of, you know, there is a lot of science trying to kind of get from this point of the cosmology, getting to the point of having the planet Earth, and then on planet Earth, life as we know it, to start. That's a completely different talk than what we had. There's no question, and this is about the tough part. We indicate that here we get two accounts. And you, as a believer, you have to make peace and to understand those two accounts in synchrony. There's the account of the Bible that tells us in Genesis 1 and 2 how God created man, okay? And then you get the account that you all know from your biology books very, very well, how many millions of years and how this transition went through this, okay? That's what most common biology books would cite. So the question then becomes, how can you put these two together? The first thing you have to come in, and here remember when I talked about in the beginning, I'm not going to be able to teach you everything in half an hour, but I want to give you some framework to work with, okay? The first thing when you're talking, when you're thinking about evolution, anything you're starting with, you have to define it. How do you define evolution? So this is the definition of evolution as the extreme version of a Darwinist. When you talk about the term Darwinist, okay, Darwinist is a person who believes in the extreme definition of evolution, as I will list it to you now. Number one, change over time. Change over time. Well, does anyone disagree with that? Absolutely not. Look at any one of you. You age from day to day, right? You shed your skin cells and you change them from day to day. You change your blood every couple of weeks, right? So that change is not inconsistent with what you see with your naked eyes. Number two, the mechanisms for change. So change is a given thing that we observe, okay? But what a Darwinist would say that the mechanism for this is basically based on random or the natural selection. It's a very random process. There is a lot of truth to that. Yes, it is random. How do I know this? Well, when anyone has cancer, it's a random change. Was it planned by the person to have cancer that their genes would change to the point that would make cancer cells? No, it was a random change. So the random change does not bother me as a believer. When a couple, they have a baby, and there's something goes wrong with the genes of the baby to a random change, the baby is deformed at birth. Is that a random change or a planned change? It's a random change. So this by itself doesn't carry any problem. The issue comes with here. That most Darwinists, and remember what I said, you know, because you could come and tell me, George, do you believe in evolution? Well, if it was the previous slide, I totally believe in evolution. Okay? So within that confine of that definition, I believe in evolution. But now when you add what a Darwinist would say, I believe in evolution, here's what they add on. And these two are where we split paths. Pay attention. The Darwinists would say that in evolution, we all have a universal common descent, which means as basic as simple. One cell, which was the beginning of life, and we'll talk about the beginning of life. One cell was the beginning of life. Out of this came everything that you see in this current age. So over the millions and billions of years, it started as one cell, and it came to the point that what you're seeing right now. That's what a Darwinist would say. Although they may not be able to go into the mechanisms of how they got to that, but at least as a belief, that's what they believe in. And then this is the last one, that it is completely done through an unguided, unintelligent, purposeless material process. Do you guys recognize that every single word in this definition is written to cancel God? When you say it's guided, unguided, well, God is guided. Unintelligent, God is intelligent. Purposeless, God is for a purpose. Material, God is not material. So when you take a Darwinist in their pure sense and they tell you, okay, how do you define evolution? That's how it defines. So Darwinism is extreme evolution, not all evolution. So what's the problem with what we're talking about? The problem is that, and here's what I want to also, one of the highlights of this talk. Trust me when I tell you, in this country at this point, there are some absolute true Christians, I know that there are Christians, who believe in evolution all throughout its definition until the last point. So you remember that last point there? Okay? They even believe up till here, and we'll argue that. I'm not saying that's what I believe, okay? But they would say that they believe all the way up till number 3 here. But when it comes to number 4, they'll say no. Because they look at the whole creation as the difference, and it's like, it doesn't matter how awesome it is. Because somebody would say, well, you know what, look at the human being, how intelligent he is, look at the eye. This is really awesome. This cannot be just by random chance. The way that they look at it is the difference between the Grand Canyon. Is the Grand Canyon awesome? Absolutely. It's really, if anyone's been to the Grand Canyon, it's an awesome place. But what is the difference between the Grand Canyon and Mount Rushmore? What's the difference? Both of them are actually awesome. Both of them are actually gigantic. Both of them are pretty incredible sights. But what is the difference between them? What else than handmade? What is the word I'm looking for that we just talked about? Purpose, exactly. So the Grand Canyon, there's not necessarily a purpose the way that it looks like. It was a matter of natural forces of water, correct? But when somebody came to the Mount Rushmore, no, that was purpose, that somebody thought. You know, when you look at this, like I'll put it this way, when you look at the Grand Canyon, do you see in it any signal, any meaningful understanding? No. When you look at Mount Rushmore, what do you see there? Presence. So you know there is an intelligent message. So the question then becomes for you as a human being. Yes, you guys are awesome. You have a brain, you have an eye, you have such intelligence. It's amazing. But that's not the reason why you're awesome. The reason why you're awesome is that there's a message in you. The same message as the difference between the Grand Canyon and Mount Rushmore. So then let's go a little bit deeper. So we've been taught for a very long time, you know what guys? Evolution? Oh boy, I don't think we believe in evolution. I don't think the church really endorses evolution. Evolution is considered to be heretical and anti-church. That's not the case. The complexity of the matter, and if there's any slide that you'll get out of a framework out of this talk, please pay attention to this one. Very important. How does a train move? How does a train move? It moves on tracks. Are those tracks parallel to each other? Are they extending to the same distance as each other? Yes. If the tracks are not parallel, or one of them is longer than the other, would the train move? No. That is the problem with creation and anyone in this world. Why? Because you're trying to put on one side biblical interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2, and on the other side, scientific interpretation. And if one of them is not consistent with the other, you feel in a conflict. You see what I'm saying? Like if one of them tells you, like, you know what? Man was created as is. Exactly as is. But then you go into the biology class and they tell you, well, you know what? There were the hominids. There was Neanderthals. And those are actually, semi-intelligent creatures, and those could be your precursor. What would happen at that point of parallel? Well, you know what? They're not parallel. There's a divergence. You see? There's divergence of opinion. So all of a sudden you have to make a choice. Do I believe what the Bible tells me? That man was created as is on the image of God, like this. And what does the image of God mean? Or should I believe my biology book? And then you'll have to make a kind of a conscious decision to say, you know what, I've got to ignore one or the other. Because my train of life, my train of mind has to move on. So some people say, well, you know what, hey, this biology stuff, put it aside. I don't want to be part of that. Okay? I'm just going to believe what the church tells me. Which is okay. But then when you get into science departments in universities, they tell you, you know what, your train is not moving anywhere. Your train is stuck. Okay? Somebody else would say, you know what, well, the Bible, that's for you guys in the church. Just keep it for you. I'm just going to believe what biology tells me. Because they want their train to move on. So the problem when you look at the current status of Christians in this country, and this is what we look like. It's exactly what we look like. There are as many interpretations of Genesis 1 and 2 in the churches in the United States as these tracts. And the hard thing is that you can't really tell this church, well, you guys are heretical because this is the way you interpret the Bible. So how do we put the lay of the land? This is very important. When you look at creation versus evolution, on one side you've got the evolutionist here, which is a Darwinist, which more likely than not is an atheist, who does not believe whatsoever in the account of Genesis. Needless to say, they don't even believe in God. Okay? So that's the extreme that we face in Richard Dawkins, and we face in a lot of universities. Okay? And then you get two camps in Christianity. So all this is Christianity, by the way. You get the group is called the creationist and the group that are called theistic creationists. The creationists, who tend to be, for most part, belonging to fundamental evangelical churches. Okay, so fundamental Protestant churches. A lot of them, not a lot of them, but those who are called young earth and old earth. Young earth creationists, has anyone heard this term before? Young earth creationists? Yeah. What do they believe in? What do the young earth creationists believe in? Roughly, in terms of like the age of earth and all that. Yes, you. Yeah.
Young earth, I heard there's two types of earth, and one the older earth, like the dinosaur, prehistoric area, and things like our generation,
So the young earth creationists, typically the way that they do it, is that they go into the account of Genesis, and they calculate the genealogy of the sons of Adam. And they calculate, this one lived 800 years, this one lived 700 years, 900 years. They add all that up, and they come up at that point with the age of the earth. They believe that for most part, the age of the earth is about 6,000 to 7,000 years. There's a big problem there. So now you're talking about the tracks. So on one side, the biblical track for them, they believe that it's only 7,000 years. So how do they make sense of any scientific evidence? Not even talking about man, but just fossils, about dinosaurs. How do they make any sense of that with us? You know what they do? They completely ignore it. They completely ignore it. In fact, one of the things they have an own special museum for the young earth creationists that basically trying to prove that all the fossil record, all the dinosaurs, everything else you're seeing is completely false. So in some sense, let's keep the question until after this, just so I can finish this part, and then we'll answer any questions. The old earth creationists believe that the earth itself is pretty old, okay? But man is only 6,000 years. So they would completely deny, for example, Neanderthals, the hominids, the 40,000 year caveman, okay? They would completely discredit that. The theistic creationists, those two are the camps that are fighting between each other quite a bit. And those two are probably, so one important thing. In scientific world, these are the Darwinists. The Darwinists have nothing in common to discuss with this camp. You know why? Because there's no common language. So the Darwinists on this side will never even have a discussion with the young earth creationists, because they can't even agree on how old the earth is. But this camp, who are Christians, are very intelligent scientists. I'll give you an example. One of the biggest proponents of the theistic evolution is one of the smartest people in this country. Okay? His name is Francis Collins. Has anyone heard of Francis Collins? So yes, you heard of him? So who's he? Can you just share with the group? Do you know, just roughly? Okay, so Francis Collins is a scientist. He has two big things in his CV. Number one, he's one of the people that was instrumental in writing the human genome. So you know your genes and how we map them out and how we can know different diseases for every human being? He's one of the people who actually wrote down that map. Very smart guy. Second thing, which I think is pretty awesome, he has been given the charge by President Obama to head the highest organization in the country that controls health sciences. Does anyone know what his name is? NIH, so the National Institute of Health. So the National Institute of Health that basically oversees all the medical societies that, the physicians here work with, he is the head of the NIH. Okay? He's the top guy in the NIH. So this guy is very smart. What is the difference between those two? For the theistic evolutionists, they believe, you remember the definitions of evolution. Okay? They believe in natural, in the random selection. They believe in change. They even could believe in common ancestry. It doesn't bother them. But they say that God created the mechanism and let the mechanism evolve by itself. So they liken God in a very simple term to somebody who made a factory and let the factory after that run the product, and this creator of the factory was supervising the process, but didn't necessarily intervene in it in the middle. So for most sense, they would say that, you know what? I don't think there's anything wrong in his viewpoint that man and ape could have, came from one cell that was similar in the past. They're not saying man and ape are the same, but they're saying the ancestry is the same. The difference between them and the intelligent design, ID is a bit of a problem. Why? Because ID says that, you know what? They believe in evolution. They believe in the change. But they believe that God intervened in certain parts of the process to guide it. That's why they call it intelligent design. What are these parts? Number one, the beginning of life, the first cell. Number two, the beginning of human beings. Number three, the presence of the soul in the human being. Because man is created as a moral being versus animals are not moral beings, right? So those instances point to the presence of a designer that purposefully put it in there. So the difference between those two is that this group says that God made the factory and let it run itself. He was, God, as an intelligent designer, made the factory so good that it could autopilot by itself. And God did not need to interfere in the middle, including the fact that the common cell would come up all the way to have an ape out of it, and in a different track would have a man out of it. So they would believe everything that an evolutionist would say, except that they would say it was purposeful by an intelligent being called God. The problem with ID is that it got very political part. Why? Because they tried to lobby the government. That was their biggest mistake. If they would have stayed at just saying that God intervened in the appropriate time, especially at the creation of man as a moral being, I think they would have been okay. The problem with ID is that they lobbied a lot of money trying to teach in schools ID as a scientific theory. That was their mistake. Because ID in of itself is not a scientific theory. You can't really say, well, in these instances, God did that. But they were trying to say to the schools, okay, as you teach evolution, teach intelligent design. And as you probably already know, the courts turned them down completely. And from that point, they got a bad reputation. The reality, when you look at this, belief in evolution increases in here, belief in biblical, literal, I say not biblical interpretation, biblical literalism. That's taken very literal. When you look at the churches, there are several evangelical, Protestant, fundamental churches on this side. The Catholics are about in this camp. The Orthodox are usually in this camp. Although within the Orthodox churches, I would say there are probably individuals that probably would cross over to the theistic evolution. But as a church, because a lot of people ask me that question, what does our church believe in? We don't necessarily have an official stance on this. Neither does, for example, the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox. a lot of them, if God say if I would be safe, then a lot of us are probably in this camp, the intelligent design, which means what? We do believe in evolution of the earth. We believe in the evolution of the animals. We believe in the dinosaurs. You know, it happened. But when it comes to man, we believe that it was a special creation of God. Okay? Would we call it intelligent design? Not really. Not really. You know, we believe at that point that the Bible is enough as a revelation to what we know. So moving on the next 10 minutes. The problem with challenges of biblical interpretation. Does anyone know where this structure is? It's in our country. Does anyone know what this is? Where does it exist? Which city? Huh? Which city? Okay, one of the most famous cities in the United States. Not New York. What's that? Washington. Okay. Where in Washington? Okay, or what is this? Okay, so this is a... It's not in the White House, no. So this is a sculpture called... It's a very interesting one. It's called Creation Out of Nothing. Creation Ex Nihilo. Creation Ex Nihilo. Okay, which is basically... You see this nothingness, and out of it, man is being created. It's a very, very representative thing. The problem with biblical interpretation is that our understanding of the Bible, I'm not saying it changes, but it gets to some extent modified by the science. Some people say, well, you know what, that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong, because our understanding of the Bible should be our interpretation of the Bible should never change. Do you guys agree with that? Let me say it again. Our interpretation of the Bible should never change. Who agrees? Okay, who disagrees? Okay, so you raise your hand. You say that our interpretation of the Bible should never change. In what sense?
Because the God of yesterday is the God of today.
Okay, but that refers to the Bible, not to the interpretation, correct? Let me ask you another question. Is the Bible the same as interpretation of the Bible? Are these two terms the same? What is the difference?
The Bible itself is inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Okay, it's the Bible, it's the text. Okay, what about the interpretation?
The interpretation is how we, like what we get out of the Bible, so like what we believe happened or the way we
It's our understanding. So is our interpretation of the Bible inspired? Not necessarily. So if anyone who knows a little bit about Orthodox Church, how do we as an Orthodox Church come to an interpretation of the biblical text? Can anyone tell me? Okay, theology, what else? How else? How do we come to an agreement? Say again? We never get to an agreement? Okay. You're very pessimistic. In general, so you guys remember the map I told you about the different churches and what they believe in? So can you all believe that all these are Christian churches, but their interpretation of the biblical text is completely 180 degrees different? So which one of them is correct? Which one of them is correct? It's a very challenging question, because even St. Augustine said in the year 400, in matters that are so obscure and far from our vision, we find in the Holy Scripture passages which can be interpreted in a very different way without prejudice to the faith we receive. This is very important, without prejudice to the faith we receive. In such cases, we should not rush in headlong and so firmly take our stand on one side that if progress in the search for truth justly undermines this position, we too fall with it. Such an amazing saying, 16 centuries ago. Because at that time, a lot of people felt that the earth was flat. And it came about after that, you know what, the earth was not flat. So did the Bible fall apart at that point? No. What fell apart? Their biblical interpretation. That's a big difference. That's a big difference. The problem is that when you look at the periods, there's definitely no consensus on how these periods, because we say the 6 days, the 6-day creationists interpret those as 24-hour periods. But I can tell you, for example, there's a lot of arguments, because when you look at day 4 is when the sun and moon were created. How can you have a 24-hour period without having a sun and moon? So even as a 24-hour period prior to day 4, it's impossible to ascertain that this was a 24-hour period. You don't even have a sun and moon to have a 24-hour period. That's number one. Number two, even when it comes to the word of day in Hebrew, the word yom, it's very, very similar to the Arabic word. That word yom in a Hebrew language could indicate a day, could indicate an undefined period, an undefined age. You know, like in English what we say? When you say, you know, in the days of King Richard, in the day of John F. Kennedy, okay? Are you at that point referring to them as a 24-hour period? Or are you referring to the age of that part? So you can't really say that this is a 24-hour period there. Number two, there's actually, they always talk about the gap that, you know what, when you look at actually Genesis, you can look at it, is Genesis to be interpreted as a poetic language or as a historical language? Because when you think of figurative, a lot of people, when they think that when we say the Bible, some of the language of the Bible is figurative. They say, oh, you're getting into trouble there. Are you saying that the language of the Bible is a myth? No. Big difference between figurative language and mythical language. Mythical languages are like the gods of the Olympus. Figurative language is different. Let me give you an example. When you are saying to somebody, hey, I saw this car flying on the highway. The word flying is what? Is a figurative language. Because neither the car has an ability to fly, or neither the road is not a mode for it to fly. But let me ask you the question. So this is a figurative language. But is this language denoting something that is really happening? Yes or no? Yes. Yes, it's really like something is really happening. The car's going very fast. Okay, you're using the metaphor and the figurative language to emphasize something. But is it something that is really happening in front of you, that a car is going very fast? Yes. You're using the language to describe it. So that's figurative language. How about mythical language? The car had wings, and it was flying with those wings. That's more mythical language. You see what I'm saying? That's the difference. So in some sense, when you take a figurative language, although the words that you're using as a figurative language indicate something, the thing that is happening is real. It's going fast. The car's going fast. See the difference? So you guys need to understand, that's one of the structures we need to really understand, the difference between mythical language and figurative language. To move on, this is the last point, and now this is where you guys need to remember. So remember the two paths. The path of biblical interpretation and the path of scientific interpretation. The path of biblical interpretation, I cannot in just half an hour teach you how to interpret Genesis. There have been books written about this. But at least I would tell you, do not make other Christians heretical because they interpret Genesis in a different fashion than you interpret. You may not agree with them. Okay? Like for example, as a church, we don't necessarily agree with the 6-day creationists that say that the earth is only 6,000 years. Neither do we agree, for example, with theistic evolutionists that think that man was not created directly by God. But I can't really say, well, this group of Christians is heretical or this one is heretical. Okay? So when it comes to biblical interpretation, don't hereticize, don't make them heretical because they have different interpretation. Now coming to the scientific. Now we're going to talk a little bit about evolution itself. What are the struggles of Christian adoption of evolution? And here, what I mean by evolution is pure Darwinist evolution. Number one. Remember those. Number one. There has not been any scientific evidence or experimentation that could have duplicated the very first origin of life. So a lot of times the scientists debated what was the first thing. Okay, well it was not the cell. The cell could have not happened by itself. They debated was it DNA or RNA. They came out and said, well, you know what, DNA cannot happen by itself because DNA needs RNA to happen, okay? Well, they said, well, you know what, it's very hard to create, it's very hard to experiment to make something that would create RNA. So now they're coming back and saying that the first thing that was made in this bios, this very first beginning of life, okay, was amino acids. The problem with amino acids, they're just amino acids. They're just building blocks. There is no experiment, okay, that has been able to duplicate. Even the experiment that they proposed started, this experiment had a fatal flaw. You know what was the flaw in there? That in there they had to remove all the oxygen from it to make it happen. And that was not the first condition of Earth. When you look from a cosmology standpoint, when Earth cooled down, After the Big Bang and after it came to that point? At that point, the Earth had oxygen. So what they're saying is not consistent with what the astronomer and the cosmologist would say, and how the Earth came to that point, that it cooled down for life to start on it. So till now, there has not been any convincing evidence nor experimental model that can say where did the first cell come from. And that's one of our problems with evolution. Number two is that how can such a thing that is so complex, the smallest bacteria, okay, look at the amount of base pairs in DNA, the amount of proteins. Just a single protein would go wrong. Look at the human genome. How can you get something that is such complex and say that it would all start, okay, in a flask tube? You know the fine-tuning? That's actually the biological fine-tuning. The reality is that when biologists, you remember the definition of evolution. They said that mutations happen. And through these mutations, man evolved. Or everything evolved through the mutation, through the change in genes. The problem, as we know mutations at this point, if you ask Sharif or Ayman in the back, when I could tell them this gene had a mutation, the first thing that jumps into their mind is what? Disease state, right? Why? Because the most thing that you see at this point, this is one of the other philosophical arguments, pay attention to this part. Was any one of us present in the first moment of life on this earth? No. So I come at this point, how can I look at the evidence back then? I compare it with what I see right now, right? That's the logical way. I was not there many, many years ago when it started. But to make sense of what happened then, I look at what's happening right now. If you come as a scientist and tell me, you know what, back then, the first cell came and it mutated until it became us. I'll tell you, well, wait a second. Neither were you or I there at that point. But if you ask me right now in my profession, what does mutation mean? It means this. It means disease. First of all, most of them happen in a microevolution, we'll talk about it. Most of them are adaptation for survival, not necessarily jumping between species. Most of them are harmful. Most of them are random. Most of them are rare. We're lucky. In our world, you guys know this, in our body, that's one of the reasons our human body is so amazing. Our cells, when they are changing all the time, the chance of mutation can happen at any moment. We could all get cancer like that. It's from God's mercy that these cells just die out and we don't end up with a cancer. The unlucky ones are the ones that end up with a cancer is because this mutation survived and was harmful and the misfits would die out. So if you're trying to tell me in the first cell it came to become you by way of mutation, I'll tell you the evidence I have at this point for what mutations are cannot support that. Because it does not match what we're seeing at this point for mutations. When you'd ask me, George, do you believe in evolution? I'll tell you, yes, I believe in evolution, absolutely. But in this sense, microevolution. What is microevolution? Microevolution, go ahead.
Microevolution is like changes within a species.
Exactly.
Without changing.
Give me an example. What would be an example of microevolution? Very, very simple example. You all probably know it. Okay, so yeah, cancer. So it's a cancer cell within a species. What else? Yes?
Like when Darwin was doing the birds on the Galapagos Island, like building different types of birds and different beaches.
Exactly, but they're all birds. What else? What would be something that we see in our day-to-day life? Yes?
Like a giraffe, a tree's certain height, and they have more spectrum.
Exactly. It's adaptation and survival to their environment. Okay, but they don't become from a giraffe becoming a different species. Yes? Okay, the colors. Very other simple thing, bacteria. Bacteria, guys. What is the problem right now with a lot of hospitals in the infections that are happening around the country in these hospitals? Why? Because the bacteria that we designed antibiotics against are adapting to become resistant to it. And we're unable to fight it. How did they get to this adaptation and resist to it? By mutation. But the reality, did the bacteria become something different? No. The problem, and here goes back to what I said, scientific proof comes through one of two things. Either evidence or experiment. One of the biggest problems that we have with the modern Darwinist theory of evolution, that there has not been enough evidence nor experimentation to prove that macroevolution has happened. Period. Period. And if you talk about in terms of mutation, we already talked about it by our current knowledge. They always talk about the transitional forms, that basically, you know, the transition happened from the the amphibia to the reptiles. The problem with these transitional forms are a couple. Okay? There's a big problem with that. Because they would say, well, you look at this as a fossil record, and this proves that there's been this transition. The biggest problem with the fossil record is two things. Number one, when they appear in the world, they appeared all of a sudden. There was no gradual evolution. Okay? Like this was like what they call the Cambrian explosion. There's not been any gradual appearance of them. When they appeared, there was no billions of years over which they appeared. Number two, which is even more important, when they disappeared in the same form they appeared in. Let me say it again. So when they appeared, these fossils, and they studied them, they appeared all of a sudden, not in gradual transitional forms to allow you to say point A leads to point B, leads to point C, and they're on. No, they appeared all of them. A and B and C and D appeared at the same time. And number two, when they disappeared in, like, let's say the Ice Age or all these ages, they disappeared in the same form they appeared in. So has there been any modification or any transition? That's the problem that has been not. So as an evidence, this is evidence, you cannot experiment with fossils. But as an evidence, there's not enough. So the problem is that you look at single cell to multi-cell, invertebrate to vertebrate, fish to reptile, ape-like to man, there to date has not been any evidence. In fact, you know what's even more important to this, and this is the beauty about this field of science, because you get somebody who looks a paleontologist in the fossil record, and then you get a biochemist, and then you get a geneticist. Okay? One of the most amazing discoveries is that they will tell you, if you have a transitional form of life, okay, between, let's say, a fish and a reptile, there has to be a transitional form of life. How does our body form? Our body is formed with what? Genetic material that then gets coded into what? Proteins, right? There has not been shown any evidence of transitional proteins. So if you think about it logically, if you're transitioning from a fish to a reptile, you have to have proteins that transition to allow you to survive this age and this age in the period of transition. No transitional proteins have been shown to exist. The reality is that proteins, and the physicians here would be able to tell you that, most defective proteins are a big cause of what? Disease. They don't survive. So the problem when you look at this is that it's just not doable. So this is the second argument, okay? Is that, so the first one is that the, sorry, let me just go back so I can make sure you guys remember this. So the first one is that the mutations have been shown to be harmful. The second one is that the transitional forms don't exist. The third one, which I say, remember the anthropic principle of cosmology, like, you know what, the fine-tuning? There has been shown in the body several things that have come up. If you take one of the elements that form this, the whole structure would fall apart. So you can't have a transitional form. Either you have it or don't have it. And this has been shown in the eye and has been shown in something that is really amazing, which is the flagellum. Let's show just a video for about just 3 minutes, and then I will move on and we'll end it.
For the longest time, I believed that Darwinian evolution explains what we saw in biology. Not because I saw how it could actually explain it, but because I was told that it did explain it. And in schools, I was taught Darwinian biology. And through college and graduate school, I was in an atmosphere which just assumed that Darwinian evolution explained biology. And again, I didn't have any reason to doubt it. It wasn't until about 10 years or more ago that I read a book called Evolution: A Theory in Crisis by a geneticist by the name of Michael Denton, an Australian. And he put forward a lot of scientific arguments against Darwinian theory that I had never heard before. And the arguments seemed pretty convincing. And at that point, I started to get a bit angry because I thought I was being led down a primrose path. Here were a number of very good arguments, and I had gone through a doctoral program in biochemistry, became a faculty member, and I had never even heard of these things. And so from that point on, I became very interested in the question of evolution, and since have decided that Darwinian processes are not the whole explanation for life.
Michael Behe's skepticism derived in large measure from what modern biology has revealed. revealed about life's most fundamental unit, the cell.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple glob of protoplasm, like a little piece of jello or something that was not hard to explain at all.
This perception didn't really change too much until the early 1950s. But in the last half century, our knowledge of the cell has just exploded.
Today, powerful technologies reveal elaborate microscopic worlds. Worlds so small that a thimbleful of cultured liquid can contain more than 4 billion single-cell bacteria, each packed with circuits, assembly instructions, and miniature machines, the complexity of which Charles Darwin could never have imagined.
At the very basis of life, where molecules and cells run the show, we've discovered machines, literally molecular machines. There are little molecular trucks that carry supplies from one end of the cell to the other. There are machines which capture the energy from sunlight and turn it into usable energy. When we look at these machines, we ask ourselves, where do they come from? And the standard answer, Darwinian evolution, is very inadequate in my view.
One machine particularly attracted his attention.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts and all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed. That's no chance assemblage of parts.
Bingey's reaction was not surprising. For the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid, each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor. In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe.
So what are they saying here? What this guy did as a biochemist basically looked at the flagellum. So now we're talking about the bacteria, the simplest of cells. And he tried to take this structure called the flagellum and try to take out of it any of the structures that form it or any of the proteins that form it. That whole structure would just fall apart. Completely fall apart. So what he was trying to say is that, you know what, how can you transition to something as such when if you take even one component out of it, it cannot exist. Because the whole premise for transition is that parts getting into it would survive to get to that point. So that's where the reducible complexity comes into. The last thing, which is the molecular dissimilarity and similarity. A lot of Darwinists would say, well, your genetic code is almost 80 to 90% similar to the code of apes and other animals. Hence, we all came in from the same cell. The simple answer to that, if I have a factory that forms stainless steel utensils, and I generate a spoon and a pot, can you say because both of them are made out of stainless steel, the spoon evolved to become a pot? Can you say that? No. So the same material indicates one ancestry or one designer. One designer. So just like the animals and us, we share the genetic material, do not indicate the same ancestry, but rather the same designer. So to end this, we talked about the lay of the land. In essence, what you guys have to learn is that if you're serious about learning your material, you need to go and learn a little bit more about the Bible and how people interpret in a different sense the Genesis 1 to 2 narrative. In terms of evolution, we've talked about 4 things that negate or are serious threats to the current Darwinist model of evolution. Number one, where did the first cell come from? There is neither evidence or experiment to be able to prove that. That's number one. Number two, most mutations that we know of based on current evidence lead to harmful products, not evolution of super intelligent beings. That's number two. Number three, there are several structures within bacteria all the way up to human beings that are very irreducibly complex. What does that mean? That if you take away one part of them, they cannot exist. Number four, the use of common ancestry as an argument for all of us being evolved from the same cell does not point to the same ancestry, but can be pointed to the same creator. However, in the meaningless, you can take a look at this, that there's definitely a variety. So don't be threatened. My whole point to you is that don't be threatened when people come and tell you, I believe in evolution. I'll come and tell you, as George, I believe as well in evolution. However, I would qualify it that it's evolution within the constraints of microevolution, not macroevolution. Above all this, it's amazing to me, as we looked up to the heavens, when you look inside yourself and you look at God, for he was his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Let me share with you the story and we'll end. To me, an atheist who claims now that we all evolved from just a cell, and now they're going into a field that's called eugenics. Has anyone heard this term before? Eugenics. What is eugenics? Okay. Eugenics is a very, very scary field. You know why? Because in eugenics, the premise is that we as human beings are created, each one of us, in a certain way. You may or may not like it. But if you want to be born as a super intelligent, smart guy with blonde hair and blue eyes, we can put the gene in the embryo to make it happen. Most scientists are actually not thinking this way. Most scientists are thinking in a way that, for example, if you can determine in an embryo that the embryo would be born, for example, with diabetes, you can fix that at an early stage by the use of eugenics. So most of them are thinking actually in a good sense of preventing disease from happening. But what tells you, what's the fine line of preventing disease from happening from developing a superhuman? Where's the fine line? And that's a moral question. It's not a biological question. The problem that I have is, how can we as human beings so arrogant and so proud of ourselves, and yet something as small and identified as a virus called Ebola would make the whole country stand still, and everyone is absolutely scared from the one next to him. So I know that you guys over here in New York had a physician who contracted Ebola. And I can see the whole city shutting down and people absolutely scared out of it. Let me tell you my experience. I had the blessing of serving in Liberia for 2 weeks in an Ebola unit. Don't worry, it's been now 2 months, so I'm not infecting anyone. But what was amazing to me, how can you as a human being be so proud and full of yourself and think you're invincible, and yet the smallest organism that you can't even see can knock you out and take the life out of you? Really? You are that full of yourself that you don't know that there's a creator above all of you who's in control, that you're created for his glory, and you're scared just of this small organism. I was telling my friends in the back, Eamon, that what was amazing to me is how such a small organism can make you scared of everyone next to you. Why? Because I don't know if you have it, and you might get infected. So it made everyone just scared of what they do not know, scared of the one next to him, scared to touch, scared to get close to anyone. If we're that proud as human race to think we know it all what it takes is just one small virus to knock us down. So who do we give the glory at the end to? God. God. God bless you guys, and know that at the end, whether it is you look up into space, or whether you look inside yourself, whether you go in a field of physics, chemistry, biochemistry, genetics, biology, medicine, pharmacy, dentistry, physical therapy, whatever it is. You go into astronomy, astrophysics, you become an astronaut, whatever it is. Whatever it is. Just remember, the glory of God is above all this. The glory of God is above all this. We are His workmanship, created for good works that God has defined for us. God bless you guys.
Can we do one song together? Let everybody gather up their questions. Let's do one song, we're going to gather up some questions, and then present Dr. George and have him answer. Is that good with everyone? Yes?
It's not,